because he shows.
Well, I hear things now.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Yep, we're good.
Good, good.
Yes, you got it.
Going to get going here in just a few minutes. Jose, can you say something for me?
Yes, I am here and ready.
Great, sounds good. I'm going to mute you here and take you off in a second. All right, so everybody, thanks for joining. My name is Daniel Ritz. I'm here. I'm a board member of the Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited, based here in Boise, Idaho. If anybody could maybe throw a couple of comments in the chat there on YouTube, let me know that you can hear me okay. That would be fantastic. Local chapter, as well as the Idaho State Trout Unlimited. We are excited to announce that our Trout Camp, which is our youth engagement program and educational angling experience, is going to be happening the last week of June. Stay tuned for more information on that. We have been really, really excited and really fortunate to have the level of feedback that we have with a few agencies as well as different background programs working on the future evolution of Anderson Dam, whatever that looks like. Again, more information to come on that. I would highly encourage everyone here tonight, all 30 of you, to be sure that you're checking in on not just the Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited on all your social media channels, including on YouTube here, but also the Idaho State Trout Unlimited group on Facebook as well as on Instagram. They've got a couple of new staff members who are doing a really good job of updating all that info, keeping you tuned in to what's happening here on the local level. So really, really, really excited. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We're really excited to have Jose Carey here. Jose is an educator, a local guide on the Boise River, an expert, and a conservation-minded angler, which is really important. We wanted to have him to share his experience and perspective on the river so that we can know what our community leaders and conservation-minded guides are experiencing and sharing with our fellow like-minded anglers out there on the river, so that we can all be better stewards and all participate in the resource in a healthy way to make sure that we can pass that along for generations to come. So we're really, really excited to have Jose here with us. Reminder, we're all here on YouTube. If you want to ask questions, I will personally be monitoring the YouTube channel while Jose is speaking. I'll interject with questions. That said, we will answer all questions, but please put them in the chat so that we can get to those. If we don't in the middle of the presentation, we will be doing them at the end. Is that 4 minutes? That was plenty of time for me. We're going to move forward. I want to present Jose Carey. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you. Give me 1 second. I'm going to upload the screen here. Jose, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, here you go. Thanks for coming, Jose. And go ahead and introduce yourself. I think a lot of people may already know you. We have more people on this program than we have for any that I have experienced thus far. So congratulations on that. And we are dressed to impress. So take it away, Jose. And thanks a lot for talking to the Trueblood chapter.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Daniel. So first, I'll just intro what this is going to be, and then I'll go into who am I and why should you listen to me, I suppose. So I'll be talking about taking another look at the Boise River. It sits in our backyard, and as such, it's often overlooked just for other fisheries. I mean, we're right next to so many blue water fisheries, it's easy to overlook what's in our backyard. So who am I? I'm Jose Carey. I'm the co-owner and the head guide for Vice Outdoors LLC. It's a small outfit, and we service the Boise River. We guide, and our focus is always education. It's one of those things where fishing is fishing. I can never guarantee fish, but I can always guarantee that you'll leave the day with a better understanding of the water, the sport, or just even a piece of conservation to go away with. I teach English as a second language, so my day job is an elementary teacher. And I kind of bring that into every facet of my life. I love to teach, and I love to make information accessible to people. And so this kind of fly fishing and guiding really works for me to do that. It's a great outlet for me. And I love teaching new people or even advanced people and just really expanding perspective. I do work part-time at Angler's Fly Shop. So I'm over there a lot of evenings. You'll catch me this summer. You probably won't be able to get rid of me. It's sort of one of those things. And I've been doing a lot of the fly tying classes and things like that as well. I also guide for Dreams on the Fly. Last summer, I was fortunate enough to be offered a position with Dreams on the Fly, guiding on the Oahe River, another river that I absolutely love, and I'm more than happy to talk about at some point, although that's not the focus of today. And the last point here, an eternal student of the sport. I think it doesn't matter how advanced you are, how long you've been fishing, and how long you've been in the area, there's always something new to pick up. Fly fishing is just never ending with information, and it's just kind of incredible. So I will never stop learning because there's just so much to learn. I will say, just to reiterate what Daniel said, throw those questions into the chat. As a teacher, I love questions. Whenever you have one, throw it in immediately. If we can't get to it right at that moment, we will at the end, but your questions are important. That's literally why I'm here and a big part of what I like to do. So here we go, the learning goals. Now I am a teacher, and so I like to tell you what I hope you can get out of this right up front. So proper fish handling. This is one of those things that I think is often overlooked. Handling our fish properly is going to go a really long way to making sure that we can ethically practice catch and release with the highest likelihood of success. Understanding of season and fish in the Boise River. Right now, it's wintertime, and that has its own challenges. We're going to talk about some of those, but we're also going to talk about some of the other seasons and some of the patterns of our local fish, how we can understand those and fish more effectively and more ethically. And to expand your understanding and conservation importance, I want you to leave this presentation with something new, maybe something you hadn't thought of before. That's my goal. If you can do that, then I will have been successful. So we'll go ahead and get right into it. Fish handling. Now, I am going to say, with just a couple exceptions, and I will always tell you which ones the exceptions are, most of these fish that you'll see are caught on the Boise River. This is one of the few exceptions. This is actually the Oahe River, and this is one of my best friends. Fish handling. Support the fish. You'll see that my friend here has his hand completely under that fish. you can actually see, and this is one of the reasons I love this picture, is there is a droplet just falling from that fish. That fish came straight out of the water for the picture and went right back down. But there's full support. You can see there's minimal touching of that tail. There's a nice amount of support just behind those pectoral fins and very clear of the jaws and the gills. Now, bass, I think a lot of us have gone bass fishing, and it's very common to lip bass. Now, bass can usually stand up to that so long as we're not putting too much angle and strain on their jaws, but trout are not that way. If you lip a trout, it can cause a lot of damage, and it's just something that a lot of people don't realize. So you do want to support those trout. They're a lot more fragile than people think. So avoid those jaws and avoid the gills. As soon as those gills are damaged, these trout just can't recover no matter how good the conditions are. Keep them wet as much as possible. Like I said, there's that droplet coming off of that fish because it was in the water. It was like, you ready for the picture, comes up, takes it, let it go. Avoid handling or overplaying fish when water temps are warm. This is huge. This last summer was kind of an unprecedented type of summer. Our waters were all-time lows and our heat was all-time high. And as a result, we saw some of our fisheries, unfortunately, have complete die-offs. Below Magic, we had a salvage order. And that's just a crazy thing to think about. Luckily, the Oahe River, the Boise River, and the South Fork of the Boise, they made it through. By the skin of their teeth, they made it through. But on the Boise River, we saw temperatures touch 70 degrees. And there was a time where I had to turn people away and say, it's not ethical to fish right now because the fish cannot recover. And I'm going to circle back to that here as we get on in this presentation. And this is the other one. Allow fish to breathe before release. All right. Trout are constantly moving. They live in an environment where there's current. And as a result, they're constantly expending energy to even stay in one place. Therefore, if you fought this fish and, it was acrobatic and it was amazing, you finally get it into the net, do that fish a favor and let it catch its breath. There's nothing more frustrating than running like a 100-yard sprint, especially if you're not used to it, and then suddenly being told to go jog. It's horrible. So give those fish a minute to breathe, rock them back and forth if you can, or at least point them with their head facing upstream so that there's that flow over the gills. They'll tell you when they're ready. I just kind of loosen my grip on them and I let that fish sort of start picking up its own speed and swim off. Let that fish go on its own strength, and that will just ensure more survivability of these fish that we catch and release. What to target? All right, now this is one of my favorite pictures because this is on the Boise River. This was actually down in the Glenwood area, and this was my biggest rainbow trout to date. This was 24 inches on the nose, and this was a late winter fish. You can kind of tell I'm wearing a jacket in that picture. And the funny thing about this, I wasn't aiming at this fish at all. I was actually aiming for a brown trout that I could see. And what I had done is I had followed the sucker fish that were moving up, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. And they were staged up. They were getting ready for their spawn in the springtime. And this trout was sitting behind them. And it was actually just eating all the stuff that they were moving around. It was back there just picking whatever was available for it. And my fly happened to go right past it and it grabbed it. And it was just a really surprising moment where it was like, I knew these trout sit behind the sucker fish, but I wasn't expecting to see this fish of this sort of quality. And something that I point out is you can see those fins are completely intact, right? You can see that they even have those kind of white tips. And so what that's kind of telling me is this is probably a river fish. And if it's not a river fish or river-born fish, it's been in the river a long time. And this really is kind of an indicator of the health of our water. The Boise River is incredible in its ability to sustain trout. We are an urban fishery unlike any other. There's really only one other that I can think of that is as close to this quality as we are, and that would be maybe the Truckee River that flows through Reno, Nevada. Very few other cities are you ever going to go and have opportunity for trophy trout like this in our backyard. So the rainbow trout is by far the most common target that people are going to go for. That's kind of what we're known for. That's what they're really heavily stocked. But I point this out because there are trophies available, and especially if you know when to try to target them, which we will circle back to the whens here in a bit. This is another Boise River fish, and this is a brown trout. And this is kind of what a lot of people really go looking for on the Boise. Finding quality rainbows or finding rainbows in general is a little bit easier. But these brown trout are not stocked near as heavy, if at all. And most of the brown trout that we catch here are river born from those first few stockings that have made it through, and they're kind of just self propagating now. And this was actually caught up near downtown. And this was a midsummer fish. The water flows were lower. The temperatures, this was before that massive heat wave really picked up the water temps. So the water was probably in the mid 50s when we caught this fish, nymphing. And I do want to just kind of point out, and again, I'm going to talk about all this, but the Boise River is overwhelmingly a nymph fishery. And a lot of people don't love to hear that. But we have such huge discrepancies in our flow that we have a lot of bank that is exposed at any given time. And so as a result, we don't develop those really thick weed beds that are conducive to really big dry fly hatches. And so fish make their living on nymphs, and it does tend to be a very effective way to catch these fish. Now, the large scale sucker. Now I put two pictures here because I used to just have the one that's on the right, but then I realized that it doesn't kind of show the mouth very well. Now, the one on the left is actually from the South Fork of the Boise. The one on the right is here in Glenwood. And believe it or not, this was actually one of the sucker fish sitting in front of that big rainbow trout that I just showed you a picture of. And these fish kind of get a bad rap. People often confuse them for carp, and they're not at all the same fish. The large-scale sucker is native to our waters, and as a result, plays a very important role in our ecosystem. These guys are spring spawners typically. What that means is, after the wintertime, their spawn is usually the first protein that our rainbow trout and our brown trout get to see. And so if we were to bank these fish, which a lot of people do, I've seen them just grab them and bank them. Oh, these are invasive. They're not. They're an indicator species. They're actually showing that our river is healthy and non-polluted. But it's also that first bit of protein they're going to see. And if we take away that first protein they see, that's a huge detriment to our trout. And something else that people don't realize is that brown trout and rainbow trout, with the exception of the red band, they're invasive here. They're not native to our waters, but we do love them. They're those trophy fish that we love to chase. But if you love to chase those, you have to understand where our native fish fit in the grand scheme of the ecosystem. So these fish are a hoot to catch. I will die on this hill when I say that the first big fish a fly angler should catch is a sucker fish. And there's two reasons for that. One, they fight super hard. And two, they're not a trout. So if it breaks off, it doesn't hurt your soul, right? So I'm very much all about people just really appreciating these guys for what they are. They're a lot of fun to target on the fly. And you really got to dredge the bottom for them. And the main reason for that is their mouth is right on the bottom. So they can't sit up this way to kind of grab your flies. They got to already be down by their face. And when you hook into one of these things, whew, your drag will sing. It's a ton of fun. But again, they're not carp. They're very important to our ecosystem. Now, the mountain whitefish. This is one of those fish that people kind of love to hate. I can't tell you how frustrating it is when you go out to especially like the South Fork of the Boise and you're like, oh, I'm going to go catch a whole mess of rainbows. You work this seam, you get a hookup, and oh, you feel the tug, and it's a whitefish, right? Sometimes there's a little bit of disappointment when we see that, and you're like, oh, another whitefish, and you get it off the hook and go. But let me tell you, this fish has saved more days from being a skunk than any other fish on the river, okay? These fish are willing eaters and hard fighters, but they're another native species to our waters. They've been here long before the trout were here, and they'll probably be here long after the trout are gone. The whitefish is another important indicator species for our waters. They can't survive in very polluted, kind of gross waters. They thrive in these freestone type waters that we have here in Idaho. And this fish was actually caught down in Star, and this one was just about like that 19, 20 inch range. when I had caught it. And what people don't realize is that these guys are fall spawners. They spawn around similar to around when the brown trout will spawn, but this is the last protein that most of our fish will see before the wintertime. So we have this kind of beautiful like sandwich, if you will, where you got the whitefish that spawn just before the cold time, and we have the sucker fish that start their spawn just after the cold time. Both of those are hugely important to the longevity of our trout, right? They need to put on that feedback before the wintertime, because once winter comes around, the bugs get small, and there's very few of them in very few variety, right? We switch from all these cool bugs like caddis and mayflies and blue-wing olives to basically, when the winter is at its fullest, midges are how these fish are making their living. And so the whitefish is just another one of those super important species that we need to understand, that when they're spawning, our trout are gorging on that spawn, getting ready to make it through the wintertime. Now, here's where I flip the whole thing over. This is a largemouth bass, and believe it or not, this is the Boise River, and this is near Eagle. Now, I mentioned before that we are an urban fishery, so let me tell you a little bit what that means. This river flows right through the heart of downtown, through Eagle, through Star, and until all the way through the cities until it hits the Snake River. Now, as a result, that means there are a lot of variables that come into play with this river, okay? And something you'll notice is that the Boise area, or the Treasure Valley as a whole, has lots and lots of ponds. And those ponds are some of my favorite things to fish when the spring comes around. They start to warm up, our river blows out. Man, you better believe I'm going to throw for bass and bluegill and have a great time. But as a result, the river comes up, and sometimes these ponds become part of the river for a small amount of time. And that gives the opportunity for these invasive fish like largemouth bass to actually get out of those ponds and into the river. And it creates this really unique fishing opportunity. But again, it's another bit of perspective to add that our native fish and our trout have a lot to contend with. Not only is this river fished more than almost any other water in the state, but now they have species they've never had to contend with before, like largemouth bass. Now, the funny thing is, this is not a one-off fish. Since I caught this was actually a midsummer fish. Since I caught this fish, I've gone back to Eagle, and I've actually found a family group of largemouth that just live there. And I've caught a few more since. Granted, not quite this size. This was a very big surprise, especially because I was swinging this large sculpin pattern, and it was in this really nice deep cut, and I felt that bite, and I got so excited. I was like, this is the fish. This is the brown I've been looking for. And it clears the water and jumps. And it had this huge mouth and just jumps and hits the water. And my friend who I was fishing with was like, is that a bass? And I was like, I think it was. And then my friend's like, no, it wasn't a bass. There's no way. And lo and behold, this bass comes out. And it was just another moment of perspective where it's like, whoa, this river is unlike many other places where we have opportunities like this. And again, this is just to build that perspective of, I don't expect you to go out and make a day of trying to catch largemouth on the Boise. But it is to understand just how much this river goes through on any given year. Now, what to use? Now, this is the question. Anytime somebody posts a picture of a fish, one of the first things that you'll see is, hey, what fly did you catch it on? I'm guilty of that too. I ask it all the time. But let me help add a little bit of clarity maybe and weed down some of your choices. What to use? The Boise River is primarily a nymph river. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to kind of circle right back to it. The Boise River can fluctuate from right now we're flowing at around just under 200 CFS, which is low. Those are the winter flows, and they're on the low end of the winter flows. And then it can go all the way up to over 1,500 CFS. And sometimes on our heavy snow years, we're seeing above 2,000 CFS. That is a massive difference of water. As a result, there is just a very small amount of the river that is consistently covered with water. And because of this, we don't get these really big weed beds. We don't get these really big areas where these bugs can kind of really propagate and start what we would call blanket hatches. Instead, it's kind of think of it as like little communities. We have kind of little islands of weeds and little islands of bug colonies, and they hatch sporadically. Sometimes, and there are a couple exceptions which I'll talk about with dry flies, sometimes you'll get a good dry fly opportunity. But for the most part, these fish are making their living on the nymphs that are just floating around. In particular, things like caddis and mayflies. There's lots and lots of those. And in the wintertime, midges. Overwhelmingly midges. And I've had people talk to me where I'm showing them this tiny, tiny fly that I'm tying on and catching these fish on. And they ask, well, how on earth does the fish see that? Like, why would they eat that? And I kind of describe it this way. If all you had to eat were peas, that would sound pretty bad. But if I start feeding you one pea every 5 seconds, I guarantee you that after an hour, you're going to be pretty full and you're not going to want to eat another pea. It's kind of the same thing with midges. These fish just eat one all the time. And after a while, that stacks up and it's actually enough to help these fish make a living. There are waters here in Idaho that is literally the only bug, and that is how the trout survive. So the midge is one of those bugs we love to hate, but absolutely essential to the longevity and the health of our fish in our waters. Now, all this is kind of just reiterating what I just said, but because the flows vary so much, it leaves a great deal of our bank exposed, limiting weed beds that form. As a result, dry fly hatches are very sporadic with a few exceptions, which I will talk about. Nymphs such as Frenchies, caddis, hare's ear, and midges catch fish all year long. Did you hear what I just said? All year long. The Boise River is one of these fisheries that fishes well in the wintertime and in the spring and in the summer. It's a marvel in that front. Those fish eat year round. Now, granted, we're going to have to make changes. In the wintertime, they're eating those tiny, tiny bugs, right? They're eating those peas, if you will. But we can still catch those fish. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. Fishing in the winter can be hard. We're coming off of a pretty brutal fishing season. On about Christmas, right after Christmas, around the 27th, we had that kind of deep freeze that happened. And as a result, it really stunted a lot of the fish activity as well as a lot of the bug activity. And so fishing has been a grind. The water was so cold. It was hovering down around that 35-degree mark. And I don't know if you've ever been freezing cold, but I don't want to chase anything when I'm cold. And the fish do the same thing. Those fish went into their winter lethargy, and it can be hard right now. It can feel like a grind. But with this heat wave we're kind of having right now, I'd fully expect some of these bugs to get more active and those fish to really start moving around again. Now, indicator nymphing, how to fish. Right? I just told you that this river is mostly a nymph river. Okay? And there's two main ways to nymph, which I'm going to talk about. And the first one is the indicator. Okay? You can kind of see that right now my rod is completely bent over. You can see that mug of mine and a smile. And my rod is just completely bent. I was happy as mess because this time I was fishing for suckerfish on purpose, believe it or not. I love suckerfish. Now, right here, they had just found this really nice pocket of water to stay in. Suckerfish are pretty lazy by nature, so you'll find them a lot in like the eddies and the tailouts of runs. And these fish were stacked, and all they were doing were sitting there and just eating any nymph that came by. So I was dredging some nymphs. I had just gotten this rod, and I wanted to bend it, and here I am. You'll notice that my friend just downstream of me is literally right downstream of me. These fish are not shy. You can catch one out of the group and the others will just take its place. It's another reason why suckerfish can be a lot of fun to chase. And right here, I was actually throwing a combination of a pheasant tail and a zebra midge at this time, and it grabbed the pheasant tail around a size 16, if I remember correctly. Ton of fun to catch. And this was another one of those midsummer fish, not this last summer, but the summer before. And this is down in the Star area. Our river has so much to offer, and each section is kind of its own little biosphere. and it's a lot of fun to explore. This lower river fishes kind of these deep, slow pools, and they can be a lot of fun to fish. And so this is what I was doing on that indicator. And the real goal with the indicator is really adding that weight and getting those nymphs down to the bottom, right? Exploring that whole column. So that's the indicator style of fishing. Yep, whoops, I got ahead of myself there. Euro style / tight line nymphing, whatever you call it. Gosh, it's effective. Now, I tell you when there are exceptions. This is an exception. This is not the Boise River, which you probably knew based on everything about this picture. But this is actually the Gallatin River in Montana from this last summer. I fell in love with that river. You can talk to me about it sometime. I love this place with every ounce of my soul. And what I was doing was I was Euro nymphing in this kind of riffly sort of section. What you can't see is just upstream of me was this gorgeous kind of run that came in and then started to tail out and riffle. I'm hooked up to a cutthroat trout right now, actually, which was really cool. It was my only one of the trip. And this style of fishing is done with a kind of different sort of rod. This is a 10.5-foot 3-weight, a lot longer. And the whole goal is to use what you might be able to see there. I have a multicolored sort of line. And basically, that's just monofilament or a very long leader. And you use that to stay in contact with your flies. So while it may take away a little bit of that cast stability or that distance, you make up for it in being in constant connection with your flies. And that allows you to feel those takes a lot more. So it's very efficient. This style of fishing is kind of really taken off in the last few years. And the Boise River really lends itself to this style of fishing because we have lots of riffles to runs to pools, and fishing that whole riffle to run section can be insanely productive with this style of fishing. Now, all that being said, that may not be your style. That's totally fine. The indicator is going to catch fish. This is just another tool to have in the toolbox. All right. Now, this is one of the very few exceptions to my nymph fishery spiel. This is over right below downtown. Some of you may know the spot, some of you may not. But something I'm going to point out about this is that when you're throwing these dry flies, you really got to look for an area where there's enough bug activity for the fish to be looking up. This section of water is one of those few sections that even at its lowest has enough rock coverage to lend itself to getting some of those weed mats and weed beds where those bugs can kind of reproduce in numbers big enough to create a blanket hatch. So right here, you may know this gentleman. This is actually Eric Moncada, and he's throwing right now a Pale Morning Dun or a PMD, okay? And there were some fish rising just outside of the frame. You can't quite see where they were rising. And he managed to hook up to a couple fish. But this was just one of those spots that has enough coverage year round that these bugs were able to hatch in a sort of cyclical cycle, and we were able to target them. Now, I'll read through my points because if not, I end up talking through my points. Now, while dry fly fishing is not the most consistent fishing on the Boise, the opportunity does present itself in the right places. Now, this second point was absolutely mind-boggling to me this year. This year, we've seen a trico spinner fall in the early morning. This was during the summertime. And over the course of the summer, the fish have started to see them as a food source. Now, I don't know if you've ever fished a trico hatch. If you haven't, you should absolutely fish the trico hatch on Silver Creek. It is unlike any other bug hatch you'll see, but they are a tiny little bug. And one day I was actually guiding a client on this lower part, or on the Boise, just below this bridge, as a matter of fact, and I saw tricos, and I didn't know the Boise had them. And so I kept seeing them. And over the course of about a week, I started to go to those same spots, and I started to notice the fish actually coming up and eating them. And it was a really cool thing to see. That's kind of the sign of a very consistent and healthy fishery when you can see some of those blanket hatches coming off. And it was an unexpected surprise, and one that I will always keep in my back pocket. So those tricos started to come off, and it created a dry fly scenario for us, which was really cool on the Boise River, Maine. Caddis and blue wing olives will hatch consistently enough for dry flies in the right seasons. Now, this one was a pale morning dun, but especially in the late summer to fall, as those temperatures start to cool off, I start seeing a lot of those blue wing olives coming off. And as you move way upriver, sometimes even to Barber and beyond, you can start seeing some of those blue wings coming off in enough numbers for the fish to target. The other bug is a caddis. And now caddis is one of those bugs that is a cornerstone bug here. The Boise River is chock full of caddis. The weird thing is they don't often hatch in these huge blankets. They do that sporadic sort of hatch, but a caddis nymph will catch fish year around. It's kind of amazing. But in the evening time, those caddis that hatch sporadically throughout the day, those adults come back to the water to get a drink. And that can create some phenomenal dry fly opportunities. Throwing that caddis and just searching water, or doing like a dry dropper below the caddis where you have your dry fly and the small nymph below it, sometimes can create for truly incredible fishing opportunities here on the Boise River. And I find, especially as I move from about this bridge below downtown all the way down into Eagle and even into Star, you can start getting some really cool caddis eats. The other option is sometimes terrestrials. The Boise River, Maine, sometimes we don't get those awesome terrestrials because we are an urban fishery. And the reality of the situation is grasshoppers don't make it to the river that often. Sometimes if you're up by Highway 21 or down into Star, sometimes you'll get some of those terrestrial bites. But it's not quite as consistent as, say, like the South Fork of the Boise or the Oahe, where you can almost count on those terrestrial bites in the summertime. Streamers. Now, streamers is very much a love it or hate it kind of style of fishing, okay? And this fish was actually caught between the Eagle Bridge and the Glenwood Bridge. It was somewhere in there. And I was just throwing this little white streamer. I've gotten super huge into like Euro style streamers. So tying those on a jig hook and then dead drifting it. It has been incredibly effective for me here. So that's just something to consider. But this fish was actually just at the end of last winter, I believe. And we were just, like I said, I was just dead drifting that streamer nice and slow. Streamers can be very effective, especially as we approach fall. Why do I say especially as we approach fall? Because that's when the brown trout spawn. And those big females, they're trying to put on the feed bag as they're going to have to sit on the reds for a while. And so they can get really aggressive about eating streamers. That big opportunity, high protein, is something that a big predatory fish rarely passes up. Now, Euro-style streamers or dead drifted streamers have been producing very effectively, especially in the wintertime when those fish get super lethargic. They do not want to chase. They don't have that kind of energy. So rather, if you can throw that nice big meal and get it to drift right by their face, a lot of times it's kind of like, even if you're already full and somebody puts a hamburger in front of your face, you might take a bite. And that's kind of what happens with these fish. They're sitting there just grabbing their little nymphs, but if a big burger comes by, they're going to try and grab it. And it's another tool for the toolbox. Now, generally, once you put on a streamer, we're changing our mindset. This is no longer, I'm going to go and catch 30 fish. You might, but we're going to switch a little bit. And now it's, I'm looking for that one fish. I'm looking for the fish that the other fish are scared of. That's kind of the switch that we make when we put streamers on. It is one of my favorite ways to fish. It's how I learned to fly fish. I learned in Washington targeting smallmouth bass, and so I throw poppers and streamers, and I really fell in love with the energy that fish just take a streamer with. They grab it and they turn and they run, and it's just pretty incredible to experience, and always worth a try. Seasons. All right, and so this is kind of like a big one to talk about. Right now it's winter. We're on that tail end of winter time. Our water is at its coldest point. Okay, the water's at the lowest point. We haven't started our spring runoff yet. So everything is very slow right now. This is another one of those pictures that is an exception to the Boise River rule, This is actually the South Fork of the Boise River. My friend was kind enough to take his drone out there and took a picture of me fishing kind of this soft seam you can sort of see. And just kind of a very dramatic and incredible picture. I really like looking at it. But all that aside, snow is one of those things that I personally do not like snow. I can't stand snow. But when I see snow, I can get kind of excited because it denotes that winter fishing has really started. Those water temperatures come down to where the fish, they move into their holding lanes and they hunker down. And you may find that in your own kind of fishing journey, you may have noticed like, oh, when winter comes around, the fish stop eating. I just can't catch fish. Well, they didn't stop eating. They're eating less. Their metabolism is at an all-time low. They can go a long time without eating. In the same way that a bear can make it through hibernation, their metabolism comes way down. So those fish don't have a need to eat a lot. They're still eating. The other problem is this. People keep fishing the same water that they fish in the spring and summertime. So a lot of people will still go up into the head of the run and they're in that fast water and they're pounding that water and they may be getting their bugs really deep, but they're just not catching fish or they're catching very few fish. Well, what happens is when those fish are in that low metabolism, they're not going to sit in the treadmill, if you will. They're not going to be putting out that energy. Rather, they're going to find slow parts of the water with consistent flow that can bring them that food delivery. I kind of compare it to, if any of you have gone to Rotary Sushi, I'm an absolute sushi fiend. But I love Rotary Sushi because it speaks to me. I sit in a booth next to this cool like conveyor belt that brings me food. It's amazing. If you haven't tried it, highly recommend it. But trout do the same thing. They find their booth or their feeding lane and they get right next to the conveyor belt. And as that food comes by, they reach out, they grab their food, and then they come right back to their seat. They ain't going to stand up to eat. So that's what they're doing. They're just doing this. They're doing this, or they're going this way just a little bit. That fish will not move far. So you may be throwing within a foot of that fish, and that fish is not going to move to your fly. It's cold. It's staying still. And in its mind, it's kind of like, why am I going to go chase that pea when I know another one's going to come down here any second? Okay, so fishing thoroughly. Fish some of those slower parts of the water that maybe you typically pass. Okay, the winter is that time to really explore. Fish all the sections of the water. Work your way thoroughly, starting very close. Work your way out. Take a couple steps up and keep working your way through. In a perfect world, you'd cast every 6 inches and you'd make a drift every 6 inches. Explore the water column. You may need to put on the dreaded split shot to get down to where those fish are. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Just get down to those fish, explore the column, find where they're sitting. The wintertime can be a grind, but it can really pay off once you find those fish. Now, winter means small bugs, specifically midges. If I had 10 cents for every time I've said midges in this presentation, I'd probably have quite a few cents. And I want that to mean something to you. Midges are how these fish make their living in the wintertime. Tie them on. Try them out. They can be very incredible. And the difference between being skunked and having a great day. Now, midges are picking up fish as well as smaller pheasant tails and hare's ears. We do have mayflies in our water systems, especially here in the Boise, Maine. And even though they're not hatching right now, they don't disappear from the water. The nymphs are still in there. And the fish still have an opportunity to eat those fish. Eat those bugs. So size them down. Get the hare's ear and the pheasant tail are fantastic approximations of a mayfly. They mimic all of them pretty well. Use those. Find the right size that those fish are going to grab, and it can be the difference between a dismal day and an absolutely fantastic day. Now, winter has fish sitting very still. Fish will not move far for flies. Fish runs thoroughly. Like I said, they're sitting in their sushi booth. They're not going to move very far. So you've got to put the fly where the fish is. Okay. And that means exploration. Easier said than done, especially in the weather that we've had recently, where every 3 or 4 casts, you're having to break ice off the guides, yeah, that kind of sucks, but it can really pay off if you're willing to put that out there. And again, with this heat that we're having, heat, like 40 degrees is hot, but it's much warmer than we've had. If we see this water come up even a few degrees, we could see the bug and fish activity go up pretty crazy. Now, I just noticed this question, and I'm going to answer it because I think it's very important. When you say small, what size? You may hate this answer, but in the wintertime, 16 is the largest fly I'm throwing, with the exception of maybe streamers. I am throwing, most commonly, I'm putting an 18 and a 20 on in a zebra midge, hare's ear, or pheasant tail. I'm going anywhere from 16 to a 20. And sometimes, again, you're not going to like this answer, but sometimes on the midges, I'm going as low as 24, 26. And sometimes that's what it takes to get into those fish, right? Now, and I'll circle back to questions, but that one felt very relevant right now. With temps this low, search the tailouts and pools for holding fish. Again, those fish are holding. They're sitting still. You got to go find them. There's not many bugs hatching in these conditions, so searching is name of the game. Again, I said exploration a lot. If you had 10 cents for every time I said exploration this presentation, you would be doing pretty well. So it pays to go out and explore that water, explore the runs. Things to consider. Now, water levels are an all-time low for this time of year. We don't have the runoff right now. The weather is cold, so the snow, even the snow in the mountains, is still in the mountains. Come spring, we're going to see that running down in the valley. We're going to see that affect our water temperature, water clarity will all come into play. But right now, it's at its all-time low and extremely clear. You may be surprised to walk into the Boise River right now and see almost gin clear water. It makes for tough fishing conditions because it's awesome to be able to see 6 feet down. But if you can see 6 feet down, those fish can see 6 feet up. So just be really aware of that. You still need to have that stealthy kind of mindset. Whether we realize it or not, fly fishing is a predator-prey relationship. We are going to their habitat. We are trying to trick them at their own game, pull them out of their habitat and into our net. It is predator-prey. And we have to accept some of those risks, right? I remember reading one time where even if you're doing everything the best of your abilities, for every 10 trout you catch, you might kill one fish, even if you do it perfect. And that's something we have to come to grips with as fly fishermen. How do we maximize the health of our fish? And again, I'm going to circle way back to that first slide, handling those fish correctly. Now, even though it's not warm right now, there are big problems. I'm going to go back just one. Snow. People do not realize how abrasive snow is. And if you really want a firsthand lesson in it, go ahead and take your shirt off and roll in the snow, and you will be hurting pretty bad. Fish are not immune to those things. So if you're catching that fish and you're setting it on the snow and you're taking your picture, just know that fish is feeling the effects of that. It's getting the slime scraped off of its skin. It's getting those abrasions. And even if after that you pick up that fish, you let it breathe, you let it go, you've just increased the likelihood of that fish getting an infection from that tenfold. Okay? Sometimes the picture isn't worth it. For every picture that you see me post, there's a good 30 to 40 fish that I never took a picture of. Some of them are even bigger, but it just wasn't the right conditions for me to ethically hold that fish longer and take that picture. Sometimes we need to accept letting that fish go. And I did see an article once that really spoke to me, and maybe it will kind of do something for you as well. We all want that fish that we can't take a picture of. You want that fish that was so big, that gave everything to the fight, that you can't take a picture of it because you need to release it, and that is yours. No one can take that from you. No one can hotspot that from you. It is your memory. I think there's something beautiful to be said about the poetic nature of this dance that we do with fish and the release, and just keeping that as our memory. So just something to consider. While I do have some really cool pictures of fish, There's tons that I've never had pictures of. And it's because of just thinking of the ethics of letting those fish go and giving them the best chance of survival and propagation. We want to catch these fish for years to come. So we kind of need to practice that and keep it in mind. Coming back to this, keep an eye on temperature. Even in the wintertime, temperature heavily impacts trout and bug activity. Like I said, the fish are lethargic right now. We are desperately waiting for a heat wave to come through and pull those temperatures up to get the bugs moving and get the fish moving so we can have those awesome fishing days again. But after wintertime comes spring, and after spring comes summer, and summer is fraught with danger for these fish. The wintertime, the water is low, yes, but a lot of people hang their rods up. They're not out there chasing those fish. In the summertime, the water can be just as low, it's hot, and everyone is out fishing. You will have a hard time finding a non-occupied spot on the Boise River in the middle of summer, especially on a weekend. It's just a hard game to play, and those fish have to make it through all that. So it comes down to understanding, do you know the temperatures that are safe for you to ethically go chase these fish and keep those safe releases numbers high, right? If those temperatures hit 60 degrees, it's a good time to consider leaving those fish alone, or fish very early in the morning or very late in the evening when the sun's not shining and the water has its best chance at being cool. Fishing those nice fast areas where there's lots of oxygen. Fishing those deep pools where the water's nice and cool. Temperature is so important in this game for keeping the longevity of our fish and our fishery. Now, this is a very false statement, but I still say it every time so people have an awareness of when this happens. Water this low will leave spawning brown trout and rainbow trout more exposed. Mind the riffles, summer and spring. Now, late summer, our brown trout, they go into the riffles and they get ready to lay their eggs. And they create something called a red, which is basically a nest. It's just a kind of nice word for it. I don't know where it comes from, but I like to think it's from salmon because they come up and they turn red, and then like fish eggs are reddish. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but that's where I come from with it. Basically, anytime you see this really clear spot of gravel, it almost looks like a crop circle in the water. That's a fish getting ready to have its eggs, or maybe it just had its eggs. Steer clear of those. That's the next generation of fish. Those are the future trophies, and we need to protect them. And so that's what happens in the fall. Those browns are setting up. Now in the spring, and a lot of people don't talk about this as much, but in the springtime, the rainbow trout do the same thing. They get into the riffles, they get ready to do their spawn. The reason we don't talk about it as much is that usually that coincides with the spring blowout. The water comes up and people stay away from the water because it's high. So those fish just have a little bit more protection. But our brown trout don't get that same level of protection. And this happens on like the Oahe River in the fall. They are spawning, and we love the brown trout in the Oahe. But if we go tromping around all from mid-October all the way into early December, it's a pretty big window, those fish are on their reds. They're protecting those eggs. So if you can, leave the water alone. And if you must fish the really nice deep pools or the really shallow areas. Stay away from any of that water that's anywhere from about 3 feet into about 18 inches. That's prime water for spawning fish. And it's frustrating because that's also prime water for catching fish. But every so often, for the sake of ethics and longevity and conservation, we as fly anglers need to decide when is it okay to take that risk and when is it not. I would argue that it's probably never okay to take that risk, but I leave that up to you as the individual angler. Wrap up, okay? I've thrown a lot at you. And again, if you have questions, please throw them into the chat. I love to answer questions. The teacher in me, it speaks to me. But the Boise River presents a wide variety of species and is fishable all year. I'm saying it again, fishable all year. This is a fantastic fishery. Hopefully some of these pictures kind of challenged what you may have thought. Hopefully your perspective of whitefish and suckerfish has been put into more perspective of the grand scheme of the ecosystem of this river. They all play a very important role. They're each essential players in a balanced river, right? By understanding fish behavior and local feeding patterns, there's many trophies to be had. From that rainbow trout to even some massive brown trout that live in the Boise River system, they're in there. And even amongst all the incredible amount of tubers that we get in the summertime, there are big fish that are down there waiting and eating, and they're there to be caught. If you can understand when to go and when the feeding and the temperature is balanced to where it's ethical to fish them and they're active, that's where we find the most success. Now, exploration is key to finding success on the river. I really want to hammer that point home. Sometimes the difference between a decent day on the water and an amazing day on the water is a short walk, especially on the Boise River. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten down to one of the bridges, any of the bridges, because they all fish pretty well, and there's 5 or 6 anglers in there. And I tell myself, well, I'll just take a short walk downstream or upstream, and I'm usually in water where a lot less people fish. It's shocking, but a lot of times us as anglers, we want to get into the easiest places to fish, and that happens to be those bridges. Go ahead and take a walk. One of these days, get on your bike and ride the greenbelt. You will be amazed at how amazing the water looks in different parts of the river. A short walk can mean the big difference between catching a fish that's been caught a lot of times and really well educated, and a fish that's a lot more willing to bite. Now, don't be afraid to go deep with your flies. While some dries are beginning to show up, nymphs still remain the majority of a fish's diet. Okay, as spring comes around, we're going to start seeing those. We'll see some more blue wing olives. We're going to see PMDs, pale morning duns. We're going to see all kinds of awesome bugs that we love. We'll see squallas on the Oahe, stoneflies on the South Fork, caddis everywhere. We're going to see all those amazing bugs. But sometimes, especially here on the Boise, Maine, the nymph can still be king, and getting down to where those fish are can also mean the difference between that small little fish eating the dries and that big trophy eating the small little fish. Always practice proper fish handling and catch and release whenever possible. Now, I have talked a ton about catch and release, and I'm not here to tell you that you must catch and release. That is up to you as the angler. If it is legal and ethical, catch and keep. Every so often, I have had a fish that I have had the misfortune of gill hooking. And guess what? I don't release that fish because I know that its likelihood of survival is low. And I'm not one to put dead fish back in the water. I take it home, I process it, and I honor the sacrifice that that fish just made by grabbing my fly. And you better believe when spring comes around, I'll go to CJ Strike and I'll catch my mess of crappie. That's okay. But keep your mind level and balance it, right? Maybe don't keep that 25-inch rainbow you just caught out of the Boise, because that is the breeding fish. Those are the ones we want to propagate. Maybe trade it off for a smaller fish, right? On the Oahe River, mandatory catch and release on those browns. And if you can, catch and release those rainbows. But I do leave that up to you. I'm not here to tell you what is right and wrong, but I'm telling you what will go the farthest for the longevity of our river is practicing catch and release. This river used to be almost unfishable even a decade ago. It wasn't cared for. There were drains that went into the river. There were dumps along the river. And because anglers took ownership of this water, and because people saw what it could be, we now have arguably the best urban fishery in the continental United States. It is incredible what we have in our backyard. And it will take anglers like yourself and me to continue to take ownership and understand what we have to make the longevity as much as possible. I would love for the next generation of people to catch the next generation of fish, and so on. And I would also love to catch some really big fish and have those generations last a little longer. So understand what the temperatures are doing, what the bugs are doing, and understand where we fall in the predator-prey relationship. We're always going to chase fish. That's the fun of it. But try to do so with a very well-informed mind and keep the honor on those fish. Respect the resource that we have because they are fragile. So these are just a few things where if you want to get in contact with me and continue that conversation, I have Vice Outdoors. Like I said, we're a guide outfit that services the Boise, and we're always focused on education. We always want to expand perspective and skill and learn how to use this resource that we have here in our backyard. My personal Instagram is Carry On and Cast. I don't always post, but I try to keep it fun and lighthearted. And then the Facebook page is Boise River Fly Fishing with Vice Outdoors. Please come share your successes, come ask your questions, come get in contact with myself and my guides. We have a lot of perspective here. And the other one is, and I forgot to write it down, but Angler's Fly Shop over on Overland. They are an invaluable resource. They will truly work with you to put the right gear in your hands. Gear is a huge rabbit hole that we as fly fishermen go down, and sometimes happily, sometimes less happy, but we can help talk you through some of that and really narrow down what might be the best for you. So thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate it. We will try and get onto some of these questions. And again, if you have more, throw them into the chat. I'd love to answer the best I can.
Thanks so much, Jose. What a great presentation, and really a great reminder of how lucky we are to have the Boise River as our backyard fishery, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know that I've got one question that I know I wanted to follow up on, but just a reminder, guys, now is the time to submit your questions through the chat. We're definitely going to take 15, 20 minutes. We'll take as long as we need to answer your questions. Throw those in the chat right now. But really quickly, just did want to remind, because we don't do these often enough for me to be good at it. Local chapter Trout Unlimited has some really fun local projects going on right now, looking at erosion, looking at the fishery, looking at wild populations on the Boise River specifically. So please stay tuned and definitely check in and sign up to make sure that you're aware of those volunteer opportunities when they're coming up, or just to stay informed. If you really enjoyed Jose's presentation, we would love for you to stay active in one way or another in supporting your local fishery. We all take a lot. It's great to give back. Secondly, thanks to anyone that participated and came by our booth at the Boise Valley Fly Fishers Western Idaho Fly Fishing Show. Jose was there. I know. I saw him. I was there. Obviously, Ted Trueblood was there in attendance, and really appreciate every one of you guys that popped by. Jose, what's maybe one of your favorite memories personally fishing the Boise River, and maybe if you could share a real highlight experience that you had with one of your clients, and then we'll get into the questions that are coming through the chat. Yeah, so one for you, and then one that you watched maybe with a client, I think would be really fun.
I haven't been asked this before, but I'm excited about it. So check that. So I'm actually going to go back to this picture of my brown trout. This was probably and if you were one of my clients, please don't take this as I didn't love spending time with you, but this one stood out to me because I had two guys out with me. One of them had kind of fallen away from fishing and was working his way back, and his buddy had still been in it and was just trying to reignite that fire. And we'd had kind of a rough morning. It had been a grind. Fishing was tough, and we get into this one seam, and probably on just before we broke for lunch, makes a cast, the indicator goes down, and it's this beautiful brown trout. And this brown trout was, I think, like 14 inches, so it wasn't massive, but it was just a stunning example of a Boise River brown. It was healthy, it was fat, the colors were pretty, and I was just blown away with it. And it kind of, you could see, it happened to be the one who had kind of fallen away from fishing that caught it. And it was just a moment of, wow, that was cool. It all came together. So for me, like with the client, that was what it was about. It was kind of that reigniting of the fire. Everything came together, and we caught one of the gems of the Boise River. And for me, that just was everything, because I'm just so much more hyped when someone else catches a fish than when I do. So that, to me, that one was really, really cool. In regard to a personal memory, oh boy, I've had some great ones on the Boise River, but I think maybe I'm gonna go to this. It's a memory with these guys, and this is actually why I talk about them so much. I didn't know these existed until I caught in the Boise River. I had no idea they were a thing until I caught one, like 5 years ago when I got to the valley, and it was so scary because I had no idea what was going on. It just tore off downstream. My drag was screaming, and I saw it. It got to net, and it was the first time that I was like, whoa, there's so much more to this place than just the trout. And I think that really sent me down my own kind of journey of what is this river and what is this ecosystem and how can I know more about it. And so I think that's probably one of the best memories that I had, was my first sucker fish and understanding how incredible a piece of the ecosystem they are and how much fun they can be to catch.
You and I have talked quite a bit, Jose, and worked together, and you know that I'm a species nerd myself, and that discovery of something new that's out there is really eye-opening and always really invigorating for me. I know. I do want you to know that while I was monitoring the feed on YouTube, somebody put up a post on Facebook on this presentation of their sucker catch, and they said, "This one's for you, Jose."
Let's go.
Yes. Mike, is it Mike Jugan or Jugan?
I love Mike. Sure. Thank you for posting that.
Okay. And then you are also referred to as the sucker whisperer, which you can take or leave that if you want.
Yeah, run with it.
There was
I'm gonna have to get it. I have Vice Outdoors. I'll get it over here.
There you go. It's your next brand. There was a couple of questions actually, and I'm going to combine these. Forgive me for not directly sourcing the names for these, but a couple of people asked about summer and fall, and specifically the big caddis, October caddis, those big orange fluttery guys, and then maybe a little bit of an offshoot about that. If you could maybe talk about those dry fly opportunities, and maybe how, when you do see fish rising to dry flies, what are maybe some of your strategies, and maybe kind of touch on that fall big caddis hatch.
Yeah. Okay. So
when do you keep an eye out for that, and what are maybe some of your tactics? I think some people are asking.
Yeah, great question. So when spring really is in full bore, and before spring, you might find, especially on like overcast kind of mornings, you might find some midges coming off and seeing fish sipping those midges. That'll give you a dry fly opportunity. The hard part about midges is that they're so small. So sometimes what I do when those fish are eating those midges is I put like something like a Parachute Adams, and I'll throw that in maybe a size 16. And I'm not actually fishing the Parachute Adams. It's just there. And then I put a little midge, maybe anywhere from 12 to 18 inches beyond that. And that's the fly that I'm actually fishing. And I'm using the other dry as almost an indicator, if you will. And so on those early season midges, that's kind of my approach there, is just putting that fly, once they eat it and you see the movement of your other, set that hook. As we move into spring, we start seeing pale morning duns. They look like a little sailboat on the water. They have this nice yellowish sort of color, kind of like the pale morning light or whatever. And they hatch not in the morning time. They hatch in the early afternoon most of the time, which is misleading. But that can be a really cool hatch when it comes off, because typically they will come off in numbers. So the spot that was in my presentation right here is a spot where sometimes I will find those midges, those trichos, and those pale morning duns coming off. The other spot where if you're really trying to chase a dry fly bite is as you move above Barber, like maybe towards like Highway 21, will also lend itself to having some dries come off. When summer is on us and those water temperatures get a little warmer, I just start searching water with a caddis. So I do like a dry dropper. and I'll throw that caddis on. Now, we don't get those massive October caddis on our river, not here in town, but it's not uncommon for me to be throwing like a size 12 caddis, which is fairly large. We have a small kind of population of stoneflies in the Boise River, so I think it kind of plays both sides. It's caddisy, it's a little stonefly-ish, but typically I'm going to throw like a size 14 or 16 caddis, and below that maybe I'll put like a size 16 Frenchie, something very light that can get down enough, and I'm just going to do a dry dropper. If I find fish up eating, then I'll target them. Otherwise, in the summertime, I'm just doing a searching water thing. So I'm casting and I'm just drifting it through and working my way up, casting at any spot where there's an overhang, shade, wherever slow water meets fast water, like all those seams and those eddies. I'm going to put those flies there, just looking for those opportunistic fish. And that's kind of those size things. And then I mentioned it earlier, but when I'm throwing terrestrials or like grasshoppery type bugs, I will throw those, especially down in the star area where we have some of that ag land. Doing a hopper dropper, so a grasshopper and then another nymph down below, can be a really, really good way to fish. And then once we get into kind of what I call the dog days of summer, where the water's warm and it's really hot outside, I'm going out in the evening time. This is specifically for dry flies, mind you. I'll go out in the evening time and I'll wait for those caddis to come back as the sun comes down, and I start casting at them. And those fish, they start to realize like, oh, it's evening time. This food opportunity might be there. And so it can be really good. The other one that people often overlook in the springtime are ants. Having an ant pattern is always a great idea. The Boise River does get ants all along it, and the fish will eat them. So that's kind of, when I'm doing dry fly, that's sort of the way I'm going to go about it. I'm either looking for rising fish, or I'm going to search water with a slightly larger pattern and do a hopper dropper setup. Yeah.
That's a great, those are some great hot tips, Jose. You admittedly, maybe you gave more than I would have. I'll tell you that. So I hope you guys were listening, because there's dry fly spots, or you may not have too many people sharing with you. So Jose is on point. I will tell you that from personal experience. Andy dropped a question asking for 4 or 5 good spots to start fishing. Out of respect of Jose being a registered guide and sharing all this knowledge, I'm going to ask you to take that offline, and I'm going to ask you to approach and just to talk to Jose and reach out to him in person. And I think that's probably the best way to go about that. You always want to be conscious. We're all respectful, and we're obviously here because we're conservation minded, well-intending anglers. At the same time, public forums that are going to be saved on the internet for spot trapping. You always want to be respectful of that. So just reach out to Jose, and I'm sure he'll be able to get a hold of you. That's actually all of our questions we have registered now. And we're coming up, and we've about an hour and 10 minutes. So I think this is a pretty good length. Last chance, if anybody's got anything that they've been sitting on, drop them in the chat. Jose, are you okay with keeping this video up on our YouTube channel for maybe a couple of weeks so people can resource and use things? And that's completely up to you, but we would be happy to do that. Glenn's got a good question. He said, do you prefer to tie your droppers, nymph droppers, off the hook or the eye of your dry fly?
That is a good question, actually. That's a very good question. I'm going to actually say I personally prefer to tie those off of the bend of the hook. And I find that I like that because when I cast, I tend to throw just my style of casting lends itself to having a very tight loop. And so when I tie off the eye, I almost always tangle myself up on the dry. So tying off the bend lets that loop flow a little bit more organically for me. So I prefer to tie off of the bend. However, if you fish a lot of barbless hooks like I do, you will need to open your loop up a little bit and very much concentrate on keeping contact, because any moment that you throw your loop too early, that tag fly will come off of the hook, and it's very frustrating to lose a lot of those tags. So yeah, I do still, even barbless, I do tend to throw a lot off of the bend of the hook for my own personal preference. It's not right or wrong. It's just my preference.
Well, tonight, Jose, what you say goes. So that's what we're going to move with.
Do it that way then. No.
Thanks to everybody for tuning in. And I want everybody to give a little shout out. This is Chris Keeley on the screen, who's housing us tonight, allowing us to use his space, and has really brought us and upped our game for presentations. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really encourage you to make sure that you follow Ted Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited. It's getting late. We make sure that we stay up to date on all of our standard social media. Sign up to get our emails to make sure that you're staying tuned to what's going on here locally on the Boise River and beyond. Look forward to seeing all of you next month for another great presentation. Thank you so much, Jose, and I'm looking forward to getting on the water with you.
Absolutely. Same.
We're going to sign off, guys. Everybody have a good night.